Okay, welcome back. And hold on, see if we can get that far to go. So I'm getting back into the routine of doing the lectures for each of the units. We just wrapped up Unit 6, and I did yesterday a lecture on that actually went all the way up to Unit 8. I went a lecture on visual pathways, but I just felt like it was important for the students, for you guys in the class, that we get that ahead of you working on your second drafts, your final drafts of your paper. And so we're kind of back into the normal schedule. So we're going to be starting Unit 7 at the beginning in the logical place with the art historical lecture. We're going to be kind of continuing the story we've been telling of how the Renaissance got to the Baroque, and then from the beginning of the Baroque to kind of the middle period of the Baroque. And now we're going to continue that story, kind of starting about 1650 and talking about some of the changes in the Baroque. And we're shifting our focus, moving up towards primarily looking at Dutch painters. And yeah, so that's where we're going to begin, which means that my screen needs to behave. So like I said, that's where we're going to begin. So we begin with two different Dutch painters, Vermeer and Rembrandt. And there have we're looking at both like their artwork, but also their careers. I'm going to move my port thing over to the side a little bit. Actually, we don't need to see me at all. That's better. Okay. And so I want to just kind of discuss some of the things that we might learn by just sort of looking at their careers, but also looking at their painting and seeing what this says about the Baroque. So Vermeer was an artist, but he was also an art dealer. He made his living primarily through the buying and selling of other people's art, but he also made paintings himself. And his paintings are in some ways they show some of the influence of the Baroque, but in some ways they kind of stand out as being odd and different. His compositions tend to be much more quiet, restrained, and grid-like. If you really start looking at how many of his compositions, things just start lining up with horizontals and verticals. A number of art theorists of the 20th century have made the connection between Vermeer and the way he composes and Mondrian. That there is and when we get to Mondrian, I'll bring that up again. There's this definite kind of connection. There's this very, very orderly, very grid-like way of organizing the page space. And that's not particularly very Baroque. And there is his he used the camera obscura more than many. Like we're pretty certain that Caravaggio used the camera obscura, where he projected onto his paintings, but Vermeer really was the master of it. I wonder if I have any details. No, like if you look at like the way he is breaking all of this information down into these little blips of shapes, which is very photographic. So strangely enough, him being more photographic makes his paintings more abstract because they're more shape-based rather than form-based, if that makes sense. And he had this great way of kind of organizing so that he could like play off these really soft shapes and then have like these crisp, kind of like glare shapes kind of floating on top and knowing that our brains would merge them together. And so he's using a camera obscura. He has this very kind of very composed, very grid-like way of organizing page space. But other things about the way he painted, like his interest in genre scenes and his interest in kind of like using genre scenes to make sort of allegorical statements is, if not very Baroque, it was very Dutch Baroque. It was very much kind of like of that place and time. And his interest in just, reproduction of fine details. Also very much a definitely tied to like what we see in Baroque Dutch still life painting. So there is that. And you can kind of see that there's in some ways the the Dutch Baroque, there's this tradition that goes all the way back to the Dutch Renaissance, right? Like that Jan van Eyck would have painted a chandelier with about the same sort of exactitude. Jan van Eyck might have been a little bit more fussy. There's a little bit of a sense of gesture to here. But this is not a Rubens painting. This is definitely not a Caravaggio painting. This is not a Velázquez painting. It's not fiery, quick brushstrokes that all together create the illusion of tightness and crisp information. It's much more tight, crisp information all the way through until you get, like I said, up close, and then you really realize that some of this is a very kind of photographic way of laying down these shapes. Whereas Rembrandt was made his living by painting, and for a part of his life wasn't extremely successful. So Vermeer wasn't particularly successful as a painter, and it wasn't until long after his death that he was discovered as the great painter that he actually is. Like I said, he made, he supported his family, he made his living primarily selling paintings, primarily being a dealer. But but Rembrandt at the beginning of his career was a very successful painter um, and had lots of compositions. And this painting probably gives you a good sense of like the success and the kind of paintings that he made a lot of his money with, the paintings that were about um, these kind of group portraits. And yeah, I love this painting. It's an amazing painting. And Rembrandt, though, less for more for just practice than for selling. Rembrandt made a ton of self-portraits, probably more than any other Baroque artist, quite possibly more than just about any artist ever. Did self-portraits in printmaking, did self-portraits in drawing, did self-portraits in painting, tons and tons of painted self-portraits and did them like all through his life. So one of the great things about Rembrandt's self-portraits is we can see him aging. We can see him just how his life is changing from image to image. He was probably one of the great masters of printmaking. Really, uh, it's Dürer and then Rembrandt and then maybe Goya and then everybody else in terms of the great artists who were also great printmakers. And another thing I wanted to point out is that like Rembrandt was a really imaginative artist. And so there is there's a sense of like looking when you look at his whole body of work, there is a sense that he was anticipating where aesthetics were going to go, not just for the next 30 years, but also to a degree for the next 100 or 200 years. There's an almost proto-romantic spirit to a lot of these paintings, and which I think really is really interesting. So another artist that we look at this stage is we're looking at Anthony van Dyck, and primarily because I want to continue the story of Rubens, right? Anthony van Dyck was the apprentice of Rubens. In fact, you have seen pictures of Anthony van Dyck already because he was also um, one of Rubens' primary models. Uh, Anthony van Dyck, this is a self-portrait right here, was in the Descent from the Cross. Anthony van Dyck plays the role of the beloved disciple. So he's the one in the red robe who's kind of at the bottom of the cross, helping to carry Jesus off the cross. And it's through Anthony van Dyck that Rubens' kind of manner further spreads. Anthony van Dyck goes to other royal families that Rubens did not have much success selling to, and most notably, Van Dyck eventually settles in England and starts to make a very good living there, but also kind of like brings the Rubens aesthetic of painting to to Britain. At the same time, we have this ever increasing Baroque interest in Baroque architecture and in the combining of painting with architecture, especially on ceiling paintings. And so I think for you guys, probably when you think of ceiling paintings, you probably think of something like the Sistine Chapel, but really the that was just the start of this trend. And where it ends up with these paintings like by Pazzo, who is making these very, and then eventually to Tiepolo, making these paintings where it's like um, the architecture seems to be dissolving away into the space of the heavens, and these figures are going into the architecture, but also overlapping the architecture. He was also very interested in trompe l'oeil effects. Pazzo was. So like this dome here doesn't actually exist. It's purely an optical painted dome. Now the odd thing about it is it can only work from one point of view. You have to be at one exact angle for it to look really believably like, wow, there's a dome there, which just happens to be the view that this photograph is taking. And so, kind of the logical following of that trend that Pazzo starts much earlier, right? Like at the turn of the century, about 50 years later, Tiepolo kind of takes that even further. And so these are like the high point of Baroque ceiling painting, especially in churches, but Tiepolo also worked for aristocratic patrons who wanted, ceiling paintings of these sorts in their homes or like in private um, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Chapels and stuff like that. So when we look at Tiepolo, we are to a degree seeing the kind of the Venetian and the Italian sort of side of the Rococo. But to really understand the Rococo, we have to really understand the roots of it, which are not really in the Baroque, not in the Venetian painting, not in the Italian painting, but more in the French Baroque. And so it really starts with Poussin. And if you remember with Poussin, we're familiar with these much more kind of stately, much more still paintings of Poussin. But my point is that Poussin, especially in his early career, had a lot more kind of like these loose sort of paintings where he was painting a little bit more transparently and with more intense colors, less aiming for kind of statue stillness, less aiming for everything being super solid and super kind of precise and rigid, but more aiming for something a little bit more, I don't know, poetic. And I like both phases of Poussin's career. I guess to a certain degree, I would say I favor the early Poussin a little bit more. But anyway, my point is that it's in the early percent that we see the hints of what's going to come with the Rococo. So the Rococo in France is in some ways a reaction to where the Baroque had gotten to, but it's also it's kind of like it's entirely its own thing. And so one of the main things you might notice about what Watteau, and Watteau is the artist who's credited with really the start of the Rococo. One of the main things you'll notice here is like he's using a lot of very transparent paint, not painting very opaque much at all, and painting very loosely and keeping it very kind of like atmospheric and light. And this is sort of like this allegorical, it's a reference to classical literature, the journey to Cythera. Um, and so once again, he also was interested in these types of subject matters, but you see the same kind of thing of like keeping it pretty transparent, pretty atmospheric. The paint is thin, the edges tend to be really soft. He was also an amazing draftsman. Like the way he drew was just fantastic. And so the artists who followed Watteau kind of took further these sort of trends, but especially also embraced one aspect that was more just kind of hinted at in his work rather than fully like what it was all about. And that was that they started to really embrace the idea that the Rococo was kind of like about sort of celebration of kind of the pleasure of life, and it was tended to be sensuous and about pleasure and about the paintings were meant to be entertaining, and they um, and they are very much kind of like paintings for the upper class, paintings for people who aren't necessarily worried about anything too major, or at least they create the illusion that these are for a world with no stress. And but the primary reaction to this kind of Rococo and eventually becomes the neoclassicism. And so neoclassicism, there were a few artists, but we're going to just focus on David because he was so much the dominant voice of neoclassicism. And so what defined neoclassicism? One, it was kind of a return to sort of that old Poussin way of painting, tighter, more kind of still, more statuesque, right? Crisp, clean, hard edges to everything, and less transparency. And and in fact, maybe we should look at this early painting to really get a sense of like the early style of Poussin. And then another aspect was the interest in these kind of in classical, narratives, classical themes, right? Classical stories. So this is a story from antiquity, the Oath of Horatii, but it's also a political statement by focusing on this story where these sons are pledging loyalty, like basically the father is saying, pledge to me that you will fight tyranny till the end. And so all three of them do. And this is kind of like a story about, the resistance of tyranny, which for the time this was made, when the King of France was about, it was seemingly as tyrannical and as autocratic as the king had ever gotten, and that France was really on the cusp of revolution. This painting was in a subtle, understated way, was a call to revolution. Go back just a little bit. But we also see the end of the revolution in David's career as well. Although David continued to paint past into the Napoleonic era as well. But with the death of Marat, he's kind of like showing. So when I did the lecture on art and power and art and politics, I talked about how this painting is a good example of an artist making a political statement, but doing it in kind of through allegory in a way that could be, you know, could be interpreted as a political statement, but also is open enough to interpretation. You could say, oh no, he's just talking about antiquity. He's just talking about the great stories of the classical world. Whereas Death of Marat is political in a very kind of like documentary, real world, almost like journalism kind of way. This is the image of this person at his death. So post David, the world of French art and to a certain degree European art in general was the artists were kind of looking towards a way of synthesizing, being somewhat true to the influences of David, um, especially in terms of like people wanted post David, they wanted things to stay kind of crisp and tight, but having a little bit more of the mood the of the Rococo. And we can see that both with, a body of work like Elizabeth Lebrun's career, but we could also see that with Chardin. We see with Chardin also a return to an interest in genre. That's like genre paintings are those paintings where um, artists are looking at the lives of everyday people. And unlike genre in the Baroque, and especially the genre that we saw um, uh, with Vermeer, unlike that type of genre painting where it is the lives of everyday people, but it's used as an allegory to say something else. Here, it's very much it's getting close to what in art we call social realism. Social realism is like the styles of painting where actually saying this is the way the world is, this is the way poor people actually live, is kind of like a value that is promoted. And so we see this continuation of kind of this synthetic, half half kind of Rococo, half neoclassicism sort of style spreading through Europe. Leotard was Swiss, and in England we see kind of also a little bit of like a both sides of the debate. With Gainsborough, we see a very kind of English version of the Rococo. It doesn't have some of the frivolous and definitely doesn't have the sensuous and like there's not nothing really saucy about Gainsborough's paintings, but they are painted. They have that sense of transparency and transparent kind of more luminous color and softer edges. Whereas with Reynolds, who in some ways aesthetically they're aiming for very similar things, right? Like um, their their ideas of nobility and of feminine beauty are very similar, but their ideas about paint are quite different. And so Reynolds is much closer to tied to David on that sense of like more opaque paint. The paint is being used in a more, harsher, more defined edges and crisper. Although there is a lot of use of transparency here in that painting. And so lastly, the last point of this lecture is I wanted to talk about the, so we basically been following sort of like the end of the Baroque. And so the Rococo is both in some ways like the last version of the Baroque, and it's also kind of like the the first thing that replaces the Baroque. And so by the time we get to neoclassicism, the Baroque is pretty much over as an aesthetic idea. By the time we get to these artists after neoclassicism, like Lebrun, like Lyotard, we are clearly in another world. But are we in a world of painting that represents the age of enlightenment? Is there an aesthetic that represents the age of the enlightenment? And my answer to that is I think that you could you can maybe pick one artist, um, Joseph Wright of Derby, as being like the artist who represented those values, right? He did a few paintings where he did paintings of inventors or of scientists, and he, making paintings that were about rationality and about science and about the new world that was coming because of that. And there was very much in Darby's work, at least at the early stages. When we look at We're going to look at a later painting of Darby when we get to Romanticism and see how he also kind of became somewhat of a romantic artist himself. But at this stage, Darby has a lot of the idealism and hope for the future that's contained in the Age of the Enlightenment. And that is the end of that lecture. So I'll quickly just say here at the end. So the next lecture is going to be on printmaking, which is a fun lecture for me, but it's maybe not so much fun for you guys because there's like so much to like learn and memorize. That lecture, the lecture on printmaking, probably has more testable information in it than just about any other lecture. The next lecture is on perspective in space, which is more complicated than you probably think. And we're talking about space here. We're only talking about pictorial space. We've already covered real space back in Unit 4. And then the last lecture for Unit 7 is on the very notion of like artists wanting to study things. And we're just going to kind of like explore that a little bit. Okay, that is the end. Thank you very much.